He didn't even look at her when she spoke. Someone whispered at the table, just loud enough for Margaret Collins to hear. And yet her son Daniel continued his conversation as if she didn't exist. The dining room was warm, filled with the soft glow of recessed lighting and the familiar scent of roasted chicken, garlic, and fresh-baked rolls, the kind of meal Margaret had spent decades perfecting for moments like this, moments that were supposed to bring family closer together, not quietly tear it apart. She sat at the far end of the long oak table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp, observant, followed every movement, every glance, every pause that seemed just slightly too deliberate. Daniel laughed at something Olivia said, leaning toward his wife with an attentiveness Margaret hadn't seen directed at her in years, and when Margaret gently cleared her throat, preparing to ask a simple question about his work, he reached for his glass of water instead, interrupting her without a word, without even acknowledging that she had spoken. It wasn't the interruption that unsettled her. It was the absence of correction, the absence of awareness, as though her voice had never entered the room at all. Around the table, conversations continued. Silverware clinked softly against plates, and no one turned their head. No one filled the silence that followed her unfinished sentence. Margaret let her lips close slowly, as if sealing away something fragile, something she wasn't ready to examine yet. Olivia's smile lingered just a fraction too long, her eyes flicking toward Margaret before returning to Daniel, a look so brief it could have been dismissed as coincidence, if not for the subtle tightening at the corner of her mouth. Margaret noticed that too. She noticed everything. The way Olivia guided the conversation, redirecting it whenever it drifted too close to Margaret, the way Daniel followed her lead without question, the way decisions were mentioned casually, plans, arrangements, future events, that Margaret had never been consulted about, never even informed of until now. Sitting there like a guest in a home she once helped build, she reached for her napkin, smoothing it across her lap with deliberate care, grounding herself in the small, familiar gesture. This was not the first time something had felt off. There had been missed calls, shortened visits, conversations that ended just a little too quickly, explanations that didn't quite hold together when she thought about them later. But tonight was different. Tonight, it was visible, undeniable, public. She turned her gaze back to Daniel, studying his profile, the same face she had once memorized in every stage of his life, from a boy who sought her out for comfort to a man who now seemed carefully, almost professionally distant. When she finally spoke again, her voice was soft, measured, almost neutral, asking a question so simple it carried no weight, no challenge, no expectation. He answered without looking at her, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, as if addressing the air behind her. And in that moment, Margaret Collins understood something she had been resisting for far too long. This wasn't distraction. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't even rudeness. It was intention. And whatever had changed in her son's world, whatever quiet shift had taken place beyond her view, it had already begun to move her out of it. The drive home was quiet, not in the peaceful way Margaret once associated with late evenings, but in a way that seemed to press inward, as though the silence itself had weight. The streetlights passed rhythmically across her windshield, each one casting a brief glow that illuminated her hands on the steering wheel, steady and controlled, betraying nothing of the shift that had begun to take place inside her. When she pulled into her driveway, the small brick house looked exactly as it always had, the porch light still on, the curtains drawn just enough to suggest warmth within. Yet as she stepped inside, the air felt different, cooler somehow, as if the house had already begun adjusting to a new reality she had not yet fully named. She set her purse down in its usual place, hung her coat carefully, and paused for a moment in the entryway, listening to the stillness, the kind of stillness that had once been comforting after long days filled with noise and responsibility, but now felt like a quiet echo of absence. Margaret moved into the kitchen, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic, rinsing a glass, filling it with water, taking a slow sip as she leaned lightly against the counter, her mind replaying the evening not in broad strokes but in fragments, in the small details that most people would overlook but that she had learned, over a lifetime, to recognize as the true language of change. Daniel had not looked at her. Not once. Even when she spoke directly. Even when there had been a natural pause in conversation, an opening that would have once invited his attention without effort, he had chosen, calmly and consistently, to direct his focus elsewhere. It was not avoidance born from discomfort. It was something cleaner than that. Something more practiced. She dried the glass and set it carefully on the rack. Her reflection faintly visible in the darkened window above the sink. Her silver hair catching the soft light from the overhead fixture. Her expression composed. Almost unreadable. There had been a time, not so long ago, when Daniel would call her every Sunday morning without fail. When he would ask for her advice about small things that did not truly require advice. Just the reassurance of her voice. When he would show up at this very kitchen table and linger over coffee long after the cup had gone cold. That version of him had not disappeared overnight. It had receded gradually, replaced piece by someone more distant, more measured, someone who spoke in schedules and plans that seemed to leave less and less room for her. Margaret walked into the living room and sat down in her usual chair, the fabric worn just enough to mold to her frame. A quiet testament to years of familiarity. She did not turn on the television. Instead, she let the silence remain, allowing her thoughts to settle into a clearer pattern. Olivia had been watching her. Not openly. Not in a way that would draw attention. But with a precision that suggested awareness, control, perhaps even anticipation. The redirection of conversation. The subtle interruptions. The way decisions were presented as already finalized. These were not random occurrences. They formed a structure, one that Margaret could now begin to trace, even if she did not yet see its full shape. She rested her hands in her lap, her fingers loosely interlaced, her breathing even. This was not confusion. It was not imagination. Something had shifted, and it had been shifting for some time. Tonight had simply been the first moment it became impossible to ignore. And as Margaret Collins sat there in the quiet of her own home, she realized that whatever was unfolding around her had already been set in motion long before she noticed it. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity that Margaret Collins had not felt in months, the kind that comes not from peace but from recognition. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window in thin, pale strips, illuminating the countertop where she had already set out a single plate, a cup of coffee, and a small bowl of fruit, her routine unchanged in appearance yet subtly different in intention. She moved through her morning with the same measured precision she had always carried, but now each action seemed to exist alongside a second layer of awareness, one that observed rather than simply experienced. As she sat down at the table, she did not reach for the newspaper as she usually would. Instead, she let her gaze rest on the empty chair across from her, the one Daniel used to occupy on his frequent visits, back when showing up had not required scheduling, back when presence had been instinctive rather than negotiated. She took a sip of her coffee, letting the warmth settle before her thoughts began to move again, not scattered this time, but organized, deliberate, as if something inside her had decided it was time to stop feeling and start understanding. There had been signs, many of them, subtle enough to dismiss individually, but now impossible to ignore when placed together. The birthday dinner that had been quietly rescheduled without her knowledge, the holiday plans that had shifted at the last minute with explanations that sounded reasonable until she examined them later, the phone calls that had grown shorter, more transactional, as though she had become a task to complete rather than a person to connect with. And always, in the background, Olivia, present without being obvious, guiding without appearing to lead, her influence woven into the spaces between words. Margaret stood and carried her plate to the sink, rinsing it carefully, her reflection once again faint in the glass, her expression steady, almost detached. She remembered a conversation from 3 months earlier, one that had seemed insignificant at the time. Daniel had mentioned, almost casually, that they were considering making some changes. Something about restructuring finances, simplifying responsibilities, using phrases that sounded practical but now echoed differently in her mind. He had not asked for her opinion. He had not even explained what those changes meant for her. At the time, she had let it pass, trusting that clarity would come later. It had not. Instead, there had been more distance, more decisions made elsewhere, more moments where she found herself being informed rather than included. Margaret dried her hands slowly and walked into the hallway, pausing by the small table where she kept her mail. There were a few envelopes there, neatly stacked, nothing unusual at first glance. Yet she found herself looking at them differently, as if they might contain answers she had not thought to search for before. She did not open them immediately. Instead, she let her hand rest lightly on the surface of the table, her fingers tracing the edge, grounding herself in the physical reality of the moment. This was not about a single dinner. It was not about one conversation or one glance that had been withheld. It was a pattern, and patterns, she knew, did not form by accident. They were built, piece by piece, choice by choice, until they became something solid enough to shape outcomes. She turned away from the table and moved toward the living room, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged, but her mind now fully engaged in a different kind of process. Margaret Collins was no longer asking whether something was wrong. She was beginning to ask what, exactly, had already been decided without her. Margaret Collins did not open the envelopes that morning, not immediately, because something in her had learned that timing mattered, that understanding required more than impulse, and instead she carried them with her into the living room, placing them carefully on the coffee table before sitting down in her usual chair. Her posture composed, her breathing even, her eyes resting not on the mail but on the quiet room around her, as if she were placing herself back into a space she needed to reassess. It had not always been like this. There had been a time when decisions flowed naturally through conversation, when Daniel would sit across from her, his voice open, his thoughts unfinished until she responded, when even small changes in his life included her without question, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something that now felt distant, almost abstract. She let her gaze drift to the framed photographs on the shelf, moments captured from years that had seemed stable, reliable, predictable in the best way. Holidays, birthdays, ordinary afternoons that had carried no tension, no hidden structure beneath them. But memory, she realized, could be selective. And what once appeared seamless might have always contained early signs she had chosen not to see. Her attention returned to the envelopes, her fingers finally moving toward them, not hurried, not hesitant, simply deliberate. The first one she opened was routine, a utility statement, familiar numbers, expected details, nothing that required more than a brief glance before setting it aside. The second was similar, predictable, uneventful. It was the third that caused her hand to pause, not because of its appearance, which was ordinary, but because of the return address, one she recognized but could not immediately place within the context of her current routine. She opened it slowly, unfolding the contents with care, her eyes scanning the lines once, then again, not because they were difficult to read, but because they required a shift in understanding. The document referenced an account, one that carried her name, yet the contact information had been updated, changed to reflect a different address, a different phone number, neither of which belonged to her. Margaret did not react outwardly. She did not frown, did not sigh, did not move with any visible urgency. Instead, she placed the paper flat on the table and rested her hands beside it, allowing the information to settle into place. This was not a mistake. It was too precise, too aligned with the pattern she had begun to trace. She thought back to the conversation Daniel had mentioned months ago, the vague references to restructuring, to simplifying, to making things easier. Easier for whom? She now wondered. And at what cost? Olivia's voice echoed faintly in her memory. Not in specific words, but in tone. Controlled, confident, always just slightly ahead of the conversation, as if she were guiding it toward an outcome already decided. Margaret leaned back slightly, her gaze steady, her mind no longer searching for confirmation but beginning to map intention. This was not about exclusion in a social sense, not simply about being ignored at a dinner table. This was structural, intentional, organized, and most importantly, it had been done quietly, without confrontation, without announcement, in a way that relied on her not noticing, or perhaps noticing too late. She folded the document carefully, placing it back into the envelope, aligning it neatly with the others, her movements calm, almost methodical. There would be time to respond, but not yet, not until she understood the full shape of what had been set in motion around her. And as Margaret Collins sat there, the morning light shifting slowly across the room, she realized that the silence she had once mistaken for peace had, in fact, been something else entirely. Margaret Collins did not rush to make a phone call or confront anyone that morning, because she understood something that had taken her years to learn. That information, once revealed too early, could be redirected, explained away, or quietly corrected before its full meaning had time to surface, and so instead she chose patience, the kind that did not come from hesitation but from control. She gathered the envelopes into a neat stack and placed them in the drawer beside her chair, not hidden, but not visible either, as if she were setting them aside not to forget, but to allow the next step to unfold with clarity. The house remained quiet, the ticking of the wall clock marking time in steady, even intervals, and Margaret found herself listening to it, not because it filled the silence, but because it gave structure to her thoughts as they began to align into something more precise. By mid-morning, she had dressed as she always did, in a simple blouse and slacks, her appearance unchanged, her routine intact, yet there was a subtle difference in the way she moved. A slight pause before each action, as though she were measuring not just what she did, but why she did it. She picked up her keys and stepped outside, locking the door behind her with the same familiar motion, but instead of heading toward the grocery store as she had planned the night before, she turned in the opposite direction, her car moving steadily through streets she knew by heart, toward a destination she had not needed in years. The bank sat at the corner of Maple and 3rd, its glass doors reflecting the late morning sun, its interior cool and quiet, the kind of place where conversations were kept low and details mattered. Margaret walked inside with calm assurance, approaching the counter with a polite smile that revealed nothing of her purpose, only that she was there on ordinary business, like anyone else. When she requested information about her account, her voice was steady, measured, and the young man assisting her responded in kind, tapping lightly at his keyboard, his expression neutral at first, then shifting, just slightly, as he reviewed the details on his screen. Margaret watched him carefully, not staring, not pressing, simply observing, the way she had learned to do when something beneath the surface required attention. There was a brief pause, a hesitation that did not belong to routine transactions, and then he cleared his throat and asked if she had recently updated her contact information. Margaret answered simply that she had not. The silence that followed was short, but it carried weight. The young man explained, carefully, that changes had been made, authorized changes, processed through proper channels, nothing irregular in appearance, yet not initiated by her. Margaret nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, her expression unchanged, her mind already moving ahead of the conversation, placing this new confirmation into the structure she had begun to see forming around her. She did not ask who had made the changes, not yet, because the answer, she suspected, would not come directly, and even if it did, it would not be the full truth. Instead, she thanked him, requested printed copies of the recent activity, and waited quietly as the papers were prepared, her hands resting lightly on the counter, her posture composed. When she left the bank, The envelope in her hand felt no heavier than the one she had placed in the drawer that morning, yet its contents carried a clarity that could no longer be set aside as coincidence. As Margaret Collins returned to her car, she did not feel shock, or even anger, but something far more precise, a recognition that what had once seemed like distance was, in fact, design, and that the decisions affecting her life were no longer being made in her presence, but around her, and perhaps, very deliberately, without her. Margaret Collins placed the envelope from the bank on her kitchen table with the same careful precision she had shown all morning, aligning it beside the others as if order itself could bring clarity. Yet she already knew clarity had arrived. Whether she welcomed it or not, she removed the documents one by one, laying them flat, her eyes moving across the printed lines with quiet focus, not searching for emotion, but for structure, for patterns that confirmed what her instincts had begun to assemble. The account activity was consistent, organized, not chaotic or careless, which made it more telling, not less. Transfers had been scheduled, adjustments had been made, contact information had been updated, all under her name, all appearing legitimate, yet none of it had passed through her hands. Margaret did not rush through the pages. She read each line fully, allowing every detail to settle into place, because she understood that once she reacted, there would be no returning to observation alone. This was no longer a question of whether something had changed. It was a question of how far that change had already gone. She noticed the dates first, spaced over several months, not recent, not sudden, but gradual, deliberate, the kind of timeline that required planning rather than impulse. Then she noticed the authorization method, the documentation attached, the signatures that had been accepted without hesitation by the system that was designed to protect her. Her name was there, in clean, familiar print. Yet the execution carried a precision she recognized but had not expected to see applied in this way. Daniel had always been careful, efficient, someone who handled details with quiet competence. And Olivia, she realized, understood systems, understood processes, understood how to move within them without drawing attention. Together, their strengths did not clash. They aligned. Margaret rested her hands lightly on the table, her fingers still, her breathing even, her mind no longer searching for alternative explanations. There were none left that made sense. This had not been an accident. It had not been a misunderstanding. It had been coordinated, step by step, decision by decision, until it reached a point where her absence from the process was no longer noticeable to anyone except herself. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze lifting from the papers to the quiet room around her, the familiar walls, the furniture she had chosen, the life she had built piece by piece over decades, now intersecting with a reality she had not been invited to shape. The memory of the dinner returned, not as a single moment, but as a sequence of confirmations, the ignored question, the redirected conversation, the decisions spoken aloud as if they were already final. That had not been the beginning. It had been the reveal. Margaret gathered the documents again, stacking them neatly, her movements calm, controlled, as if she were preparing for something rather than reacting to it. She did not feel anger in the way most would expect. There was no sharp rise of emotion, no immediate urge to confront or accuse. What she felt was colder than that, more precise, a recognition that she had been moved, quietly, carefully, from the center of decisions to the edge of them, and that the people who had done so believed she would remain there. She stood and carried the papers to the drawer, placing them inside, closing it with a soft, final motion. This was no longer about understanding what had happened. That part was complete. What remained was deciding what to do with the knowledge. And Margaret Collins, for the first time in a long while, was no longer reacting to the situation around her. She was beginning to consider how to respond to it. Margaret Collins did not speak to Daniel that day, nor the day after, not because she lacked the opportunity, but because she understood that timing, once again, would determine the outcome. and she had no intention of stepping into a conversation that had already been carefully structured without her. Instead, she allowed the rhythm of her life to continue outwardly unchanged, answering messages when necessary, maintaining the same tone she had always used, calm, warm, unassuming, the kind of presence that did not invite suspicion. When Daniel called 2 evenings later, his voice carried its usual efficiency, asking if she had received a package he had mentioned. Margaret responded simply that everything had arrived as expected, her words measured, her tone neutral, offering nothing that suggested she had begun to see beyond what was being presented to her. There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable, as if he were waiting for something more. Question, perhaps, or a reaction. But when it did not come, he continued, shifting the conversation toward routine topics, plans for the coming week, small updates that carried no real weight. Margaret listened, responding when appropriate, her attention divided between his words and the spaces between them, the parts that revealed more than what was said directly. Olivia's presence was not audible, yet Margaret could sense it, the subtle influence that shaped the direction of the conversation, the topics that were included, and more importantly, the ones that were not. When the call ended, Margaret placed the phone back on the table with a quiet, deliberate motion, her reflection faintly visible in the dark screen, her expression unchanged, yet her understanding now fully aligned with the reality she had been observing. The next morning, she prepared herself with the same care she had always taken, choosing her clothes with quiet intention, her movements steady, her demeanor composed, as she stepped out of her house once again, this time not toward the bank, but toward a small office building several blocks away, one she had not visited in years, but whose purpose remained clear in her mind. The sign outside was simple, understated, bearing the name of a legal practice that had once handled matters for her and her late husband, a place where details were not assumed, but verified. Inside, the air was cool, the atmosphere controlled, the kind of environment where words carried weight and silence was often more meaningful than speech. Margaret introduced herself without hesitation, her voice calm, her posture steady, and when she was shown into a private office, she did not rush to explain everything at once. Instead, she began with facts, the documents from the bank, the changes that had been made, the timeline she had carefully reconstructed, presenting each piece not as accusation, but as information that required clarity. The attorney listened without interruption, his expression neutral, his questions precise, guiding the conversation not toward emotion, but toward understanding, toward what had been done, how it had been done, and what it meant within the framework of the systems involved. Margaret answered each question with the same composure she had maintained throughout, her voice even, her focus unwavering, because she was no longer trying to confirm what she already knew. She was establishing what could be proven. When the meeting ended, she left with more than just reassurance. She left with direction, with options, with a clearer sense of the structure that had been built around her and, more importantly, how it could be addressed without noise, without confrontation, without giving away the shift that had already begun within her. As Margaret Collins stepped back into the daylight, the world appeared unchanged, the same streets, the same passing cars, the same ordinary rhythm of life. Yet for her, something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer the last to know. She was simply the only one who had not yet spoken. Margaret Collins returned home that evening with a quiet determination, her steps measured, her posture composed, the envelope from the legal office resting in her bag like a small but weighty confirmation of what she had already pieced together. She unlocked the front door and entered, allowing the familiar scent of her kitchen, the polished wooden floors, and the soft hum of the refrigerator to wash over her, grounding her in a space that had always been hers, yet now carried a different awareness, a new layer of understanding. She set her bag down carefully and walked to the table, spreading out the documents she had brought, not in haste, but in deliberate order, reviewing the information again, connecting the timeline of the account changes, the dinner, the subtle manipulations, and the absence of consultation in a way that made the structure of the orchestration clear. She did not feel anger as it might be expected, nor did she feel fear. Instead, she experienced a quiet, controlled focus, the kind that allowed her to see all the details, to observe without distraction, and to begin planning her response with clarity and precision. She moved to the living room and sat in her usual chair, glancing at the photographs on the mantel, images of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments that had once seemed simple, now imbued with new meaning as she considered the way decisions had been made around her without her input. Margaret considered the people involved, Daniel and Olivia, their habits, their patterns, the subtle control exercised through timing, conversation, and seemingly minor decisions, all of which pointed to intention and planning rather than accident or oversight. She opened her notebook, a small leather-bound volume she had kept for years, and began writing notes, tracing the sequence of events, recording what had occurred at each point, noting her observations with meticulous care. Each line of text a small anchor to the understanding she was building, a map of the situation she had been navigating quietly for months. By the time she set the notebook aside, the sun had begun to lower, casting long, soft rays through the window that highlighted the calm determination in her expression, the subtle shift from passive observation to intentional action. She brewed herself a cup of tea, sipping it slowly, feeling the warmth, and letting the quiet of the house settle around her, each moment a reinforcement of the control she now held over her response. Margaret understood that patience was her ally, and that timing was critical. She would act, but only when the strategy was fully formed, only when she could move without exposing her awareness too early, and only when her presence could realign the balance she had quietly noted had been disrupted. She allowed herself a brief glance toward the dining room, remembering the earlier dinner, the laughter, the quiet slights, the dismissive gestures, and she felt no bitterness, only clarity. Tonight, she thought, she would begin to prepare for the moments to come, arranging her approach, considering every variable, knowing that knowledge alone was not enough without careful action. As the last rays of daylight faded through the windows, Margaret Collins sat in quiet contemplation, steady, composed, fully aware, readying herself to navigate the next phase with deliberate, controlled precision. Margaret Collins stood by the front window as the evening light softened, the neighborhood quiet and familiar, each house and tree holding its ordinary rhythm. Yet in her mind, every detail carried a weight she had only recently recognized. She had spent days observing, reviewing, confirming, and now she was ready to move with a calm authority that had been absent for far too long. Her plan was not loud. It was not dramatic. It relied on precision, timing, and the subtle alignment of facts and evidence she had gathered. She opened the envelope once more, letting the papers fall flat across the table, each one a piece of the larger picture, a confirmation of patterns, decisions, and actions that had excluded her without error or accident. Margaret considered the steps she would take, not in haste, but in a deliberate sequence, knowing that rushing would give the others an opportunity to adjust, to mask the true extent of what had been done, and she had no intention of allowing that. She reviewed each interaction, each conversation, each alteration to accounts and information, connecting them in her mind like a map, the lines clear, the end point defined by the knowledge she had finally assembled. The evening stretched, quiet and uninterrupted, and Margaret allowed herself to sit back in her chair, taking a slow breath, letting the calm of understanding settle around her. She was no longer uncertain, no longer in doubt. The dinner that had seemed ordinary, the conversations that had seemed casual, the silences that had once felt like oversight, were now all part of a deliberate pattern she had decoded. Her awareness had shifted. She now held the knowledge and, with it, the control to act with precision when the time was right. She made notes in her notebook, carefully, methodically, not revealing emotion but recording facts, observations, and next steps, each line deliberate, each word intentional, her hand steady as her mind traced the strategy she would follow. Outside, the street lights began to glow, one by one, their reflections appearing in the glass of the window, soft and unassuming, much like the approach she intended to take. Margaret Collins understood that the moment to act would come not when she felt compelled by emotion, but when the alignment of circumstances guaranteed clarity and authority. She arranged her documents, reviewed her notes, and let the quiet of her home provide the background for a mind that was now alert, focused, and patient. The late afternoon faded into night, the familiar sounds of the neighborhood settling into a calm rhythm, and Margaret felt an unspoken shift within herself, a subtle recognition that she had moved from observer to planner, from silent witness to the holder of understanding, poised to respond at exactly the right moment. She did not need to announce herself. She did not need confrontation. She simply needed to wait, to prepare, to ensure that when she moved, it would be with quiet authority, leaving no room for misunderstanding, no possibility for manipulation. And when that time came, Margaret Collins would be fully present, fully aware, and completely in control of the outcome she had long anticipated.